The desert highway stretched endlessly under the bruised sky of late afternoon, the kind of sky that promised either salvation or damnation, depending on which side of the law you found yourself. It was 1968, and Route 66 cut through the American Southwest like a scar across forgotten land, a ribbon of asphalt where stories were born and sometimes died. The wind carried dust devils across the scrubland, spinning memories of countless travelers who had passed this way, seeking something they could never name. This was the world where outlaws lived, where muscle cars roared their defiance against conformity, and where love was as dangerous as the open road itself. The bad guy had been riding these highways for years. His 1967 Chevrolet Camaro SS, a midnight black beast with chrome that caught the dying light like knife edges. And he knew every mile marker, every abandoned gas station, every place where a man could disappear if he needed to. He lived by a code simple and absolute. Keep moving, trust no one, and never look back. But on this particular stretch of nowhere, between dried-up towns that time had forgotten, he was about to break that code in ways he could not yet imagine. Before we dive deeper into this tale of chrome, leather, and loyalty, if you love stories of classic muscle cars, dangerous romance, and the untamed spirit of the open road, hit that like button, subscribe to Classic Romance Stories, and drop a comment telling us about your favorite classic car. These stories of the bad guy and the vixen live because of you, and we have more tales of outlaw love coming your way. Now, let us return to that desert highway where fate was about to collide with destiny at 70 miles per hour. The bad guy saw her from half a mile away, a silhouette against the orange sun, standing beside a broken-down 1966 Ford Mustang painted the color of dried blood. Even from that distance, even with the heat shimmer rising off the asphalt, he could tell she was not ordinary. The way she stood, hip-cocked, one hand shading her eyes as she watched his approach, spoke of someone who had been in tough situations before and had walked away on her own terms. As he downshifted and the Camaro's engine growled its approval, he could see her more clearly, dark hair whipping in the wind, leather jacket despite the heat, boots that had walked through more than just dust, and eyes that assessed him with the same careful calculation he was giving her. This was no damsel in distress waiting for rescue. This was a woman who had run out of options and was deciding whether he represented a new option or a new problem. The vixen, though he did not know her name yet, watched the black Camaro approach with a mixture of hope and wariness, her hand resting casually near the small of her back, where she kept insurance against men who misunderstood her situation. She had been stranded for 2 hours, and in that time, 3 vehicles had passed without stopping, which suited her fine because the people she was running from would not stop either. They would simply open fire. But this car, this driver, something told her this was different. He pulled alongside her Mustang and killed the engine, the sudden silence filled only by the tick of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through sagebrush. Up close, she was even more striking, with the kind of beauty that came from strength rather than softness. Eyes like green glass that had seen things most people only had nightmares about, and a mouth set in a line that suggested she smiled rarely and meant it even less. The vixen looked him over with equal intensity, taking in the worn leather jacket, the dark stubble, the hands scarred from fights and engine work, and the eyes that carried their own kind of wariness, their own history of violence and survival. Neither spoke for a moment, both understanding that first words mattered, that they were sizing each other up the way wolves might, determining threat level and intent. Finally, the bad guy broke the silence with a voice like gravel and whiskey, asking what happened, though he could see the blown radiator hose hanging like a severed artery beneath her hood. She told him straight, no damsel act, no helpless female routine, just the facts. Radiator hose, middle of nowhere, and she needed to get to the next town before dark. She did not mention what she was running from, and he did not ask, because on the outlaw roads, everyone was running from something, and the smart ones did not share their stories until they knew who was listening. The bad guy walked to his trunk and pulled out tools, a spare radiator hose that might fit with some modification, and a canteen of water for the radiator. The vixen watched him work, impressed despite herself, because he moved with the efficiency of someone who had kept machines running under worse conditions, probably while people were shooting at him. She noticed his tattoos, faded military ink mixed with prison work, and the way he kept his back to the sun so he could see the road in both directions, always aware, always ready. As he worked under her hood, she asked him why he stopped, why he helped, and he paused, wiped sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand, and said something that would echo between them for years to come. Because the road takes care of its own, and anyone driving a Mustang like that deserved to keep driving it. It was not romance, not yet, but it was recognition, one outlaw acknowledging another, and in their world, that meant more than pretty words or empty promises. She handed him tools before he asked for them, anticipating what he needed, and he noticed this. Noticed that she understood engines and mechanics, that her hands were not soft city hands but had their own scars, their own history of doing what needed to be done. Within 40 minutes, he had the Mustang running again, the engine settling into a rough idle that would get her where she needed to go. She offered him money, which he refused with a shake of his head, and then she offered something more valuable, information. The Vixen told him there was a bar 20 miles up the road, a place called the Dusty Rose that served cold beer and minded its own business, and she would buy him a drink to square the debt. The bad guy considered this, knowing that accepting meant more than just a beer, meant conversation, meant getting involved in whatever trouble she was carrying. But there was something about her that pulled at him, something that said she was worth the risk. He agreed, and they set off in their separate machines, her Mustang trailing his Camaro as the sun finally surrendered to the horizon and painted the desert in shades of red and gold that matched the blood and fire of their two cars. The highway opened up before them like a promise and a threat, the yellow lines disappearing into darkness ahead, and the rumble of their engines was the only sound in a world that had gone quiet with evening. They drove fast, not racing but moving with purpose, two predators heading toward the same watering hole, and anyone watching from the scrubland would have seen what they were, dangerous, beautiful, and absolutely free. The Dusty Rose sat off the highway like something from a fever dream, a low-slung building with red neon that buzzed and flickered in the gathering darkness, surrounded by gravel parking lot and the rusted husks of vehicles that had died there over the decades. It was the kind of place where questions were not asked and names were not given, where the jukebox played Waylon Jennings and Patsy Cline, where the beer was cold and the whiskey was cheap, and where a person could disappear into shadow and cigarette smoke. They parked their cars side by side, the Camaro and Mustang looking like bookends to some violent story, and walked into the bar together without discussing it, already moving as a unit though they had only met hours ago. Inside, the place was exactly what it promised. Dark wood, darker corners, a bartender who had seen everything twice and was not impressed by any of it, and a handful of regulars who looked up briefly before returning to their drinks and their private miseries. The Vixen walked to the bar with the confidence of someone who had been thrown out of better places and worse ones, ordered 2 beers without asking what he wanted, and led him to a corner booth where they could watch the door and the windows simultaneously. The bad guy approved of her choice of seating, approved of the way she positioned herself so she could reach for whatever she carried in her boot, and found himself genuinely curious about who she was and what kind of trouble was chasing her. They talked as night deepened outside, and the jukebox cycled through its repertoire of heartbreak and defiance. She told him her name was not important. Just call her what everyone else did, the Vixen, and he understood this, offered his own road name, the bad guy, and they both smiled at the theatrical nature of their aliases, understanding that real names were for real people, and they had left that life behind on some highway years ago. The conversation flowed easier than either expected, moving from cars to roads to the philosophy of outlaw life, and they discovered they shared a similar code: loyalty to the few who earned it, violence when necessary but not before, and the road above all else, the endless highway representing freedom that no prison or relationship or responsibility could take away. The Vixen had been running crews for 3 years, small jobs mostly, nothing that would make federal radar, but enough to keep gas in the tank and money in her pocket. And she had learned the hard way that most men either wanted to control her or use her, treating her like a tool or a trophy rather than an equal. The bad guy listened without interrupting, recognizing the story because he had lived the male version of it. always having to prove himself harder because he refused to join the big organizations, refused to bend knee to anyone. And he saw in her the same stubborn independence that had kept him alone on the road all these years. As midnight approached and the bar emptied to just hardcore drinkers and people with nowhere else to go, the Vixen finally told him what she was running from. And the story came out hard and fast like bullets from a gun. She had been working with a crew out of Phoenix, running interference on a job that should have been simple. But one of the guys got greedy and tried to cut her out, tried to take her share and leave her stranded. She had objected with a tire iron and his broken nose, taken what was hers, plus his car, and now his crew was looking for her. About 40 guys with more muscle cars than sense and enough firepower to start a small war. The bad guy absorbed this information without change of expression, understanding immediately the kind of danger she had brought to his doorstep by bringing him here. But instead of anger, he felt something else, respect. She had not run from the fight, had not backed down, had taken what was hers and made them chase her, and that took the kind of courage that could not be faked or taught. He asked her what her plan was, and she admitted she did not have one beyond getting far enough ahead to disappear. Maybe head to Mexico or Canada, somewhere the Phoenix crew's reach did not extend. The bad guy considered this, considered the smart play, which was to finish his beer, walk out to his Camaro and never look back. But he was already calculating angles, already planning, already committed, though neither of them had said the words out loud yet. They left the dusty roads around 2 a.m, the desert night cold enough to see breath, stars overhead like shattered glass against black velvet, and the highway empty in both directions as far as headlights could reach. The bad guy told her to follow him to a motel 6 miles north, a place he knew where the owner was smart enough to forget faces, and the rooms had back exits for people who needed options. They drove through the night with headlights cutting tunnels through darkness, the roar of their engines the only sound in a sleeping world. And when they reached the Desert Star Motor Lodge with its pink neon cactus and gravel parking lot, they took adjoining rooms without discussion, both understanding that trust was being built in small increments, that they were not ready to share space but were ready to watch each other's backs. Before they separated for what remained of the night, the Vixen touched his arm, a brief contact that carried weight, and told him he did not have to get involved in her trouble, that he had already done more than most would by stopping on that highway. The bad guy looked at her with those dark eyes that had seen too much and somehow not enough, and told her the road took care of its own, and besides, he had never liked Phoenix crews much anyway. It was not a declaration of love or even partnership, but it was commitment, and in their world, that was worth more than any promise. Dawn broke over the desert like a wound, red and raw, painting the landscape in shades of crimson that matched the danger riding toward them on 40 sets of chrome wheels. The bad guy had not slept, had instead spent the dark hours checking his Camaro, loading weapons he kept hidden in custom compartments, and planning strategies for fights that might come. He knew the Phoenix crew's reputation: young, hungry, violent, and stupid in the way that makes men dangerous because they have not learned fear yet. They would come hard and loud, expecting intimidation to do half the work, not understanding that some people could not be intimidated, that some people had already survived worse and walked away. When the Vixen emerged from her room as the sun cleared the horizon, she found him leaning against his Camaro, 3 different handguns laid out on the hood like a surgeon's instruments, and she knew without asking that he had made his decision, had chosen to stand with her against whatever was coming. She walked to her Mustang and opened her own trunk, revealing an arsenal that made him raise an eyebrow in approval. Shotgun, rifles, ammunition boxes, and what looked like military-grade equipment that suggested her background was more complex than simple crew work. They stood in the parking lot as morning light turned the desert gold, 2 outlaws preparing for war, and the connection between them had shifted overnight from strangers to something else, something that did not have a name yet, but felt like the beginning of a story that would not end quietly. The call came through on the Vixen's radio around 9 a.m, a crackling voice full of testosterone and threats, telling her they knew where she was, telling her they were coming, telling her to have his money and his car ready or things would get ugly. She keyed the microphone and told them to come ahead, told them she would be waiting, and clicked off before they could respond with more empty threats. The bad guy listened to this exchange while checking the sight on a rifle. Impressed with her calm, the way she turned fear into fuel, and he found himself thinking dangerous thoughts. Thoughts about what it might be like to run with someone like her, to have a partner who did not need protecting but could stand beside him as an equal. The vixen caught him looking and asked what he was thinking, and he told her the truth, that she reminded him why he loved the road, why he stayed free, why he had never settled for the safe life that normal people lived. She understood this immediately, understood that it was the highest compliment he could give, and something passed between them in that moment. A recognition that went beyond attraction or convenience, a sense that they were seeing themselves reflected in someone else for the first time. They returned to the dusty rows because the bad guy said if there was going to be a fight, better to choose the ground than let the enemy choose it for you. And the bar's parking lot offered clear sight lines and multiple exit routes. The bartender, a weathered man who had probably been young when Eisenhower was president, took one look at them rolling in mid-morning and simply nodded, understanding without explanation that trouble was coming, and deciding that his bar had seen trouble before and would see it again. They positioned their cars carefully, the Camaro and Mustang angled for quick departure, engines idling low and deadly, and then they waited. The vixen loaded weapons with practiced efficiency, her hands steady, and the bad guy watched the highway with the patience of someone who had done this dance before, who knew that the waiting was often worse than the fighting. They did not talk much during this time, did not need to, because they were already operating with the kind of wordless communication that usually took years to develop, each anticipating the other's movements, each covering angles without being told. The rumble started as a distant thunder, growing louder, and then they appeared on the highway like something from a nightmare or a dream, depending on your perspective. 40 Chevrolet Camaros, spanning model years from 1967 to 1969, a rolling thunderstorm of Detroit steel and gasoline fury, painted in every color from primer gray to candy apple red, but unified in their menace. They came fast, engines screaming, chrome glinting in the desert sun, and they filled the highway like a mechanized cavalry charge from some automotive apocalypse. The bad guy had seen shows of force before, had been on both sides of them. But even he had to admit this was impressive in its excess. 40 muscle cars representing probably $2 million of machinery and countless hours of garage work, all mobilized to intimidate one woman who had refused to be pushed around. The Camaros began filling the parking lot of the dusty rows, surrounding the building in a loose circle, engines rumbling like caged thunder, drivers and passengers emerging with the swagger of men who believed numbers made them invincible. The Phoenix crew was everything the bad guy expected. Young guys in leather and denim, sporting tattoos that were too new and attitudes that were too old, carrying weapons openly because they thought visible threat was the same as actual power. The leader emerged from a 1968 Camaro RS, painted electric blue with white racing stripes, a tall man with blonde hair and a face that suggested he had been handsome before someone rearranged his nose. Probably the vixen based on the fresh bandages. He walked toward them with theatrical confidence, flanked by lieutenants trying to look harder than they were, and his voice carried across the parking lot with forced authority, demanding his car, his money, and an apology in that order. The vixen stood beside the bad guy, her posture relaxed but ready, and she responded with a voice that cut through the engine noise like a knife through silk, telling him his car was wrapped around a tree in New Mexico. His money was spent on this nice lady's guns, and the only apology he would get was that she had not hit him harder with that tire iron. The tension ratcheted up instantly, hands moving toward weapons, and the bad guy noted the positioning, noted which crew members looked scared, which looked excited, and which looked competent, filing this information away because knowing who to shoot first could mean the difference between walking away and bleeding out in the desert. The blonde leader, whose name was something forgettable like Jake or Blake, made the mistake that proud men always make. He dismissed the bad guy as irrelevant, as hired help or some drifter who would run when the shooting started. He directed all his attention toward the vixen, trying to intimidate her with numbers and threats, listing the various unpleasant things that would happen to her after they took her into the desert. And it was clear he had never encountered a woman who refused to be afraid of him. The bad guy let this continue for exactly 30 seconds, giving Jake or Blake enough rope to hang himself with his own words. And then he spoke for the first time, his voice quiet but carrying weight, asking if all 40 of these Camaros had clean titles or if some of them were hot, because he knew a few federal agents who would love to know about a Phoenix crew running a chop shop operation. The effect was immediate and electric. The blonde leader finally looked at the bad guy, really looked at him, and saw something that made his swagger falter, saw the kind of calm that comes from having survived situations where death was not a possibility, but a certainty that had somehow been cheated. The younger crew members shifted nervously, suddenly aware that their overwhelming numbers might not be the advantage they assumed, that the man in the black leather jacket leaning against the midnight Camaro represented a variable they had not accounted for. The Vixen took the moment of uncertainty and drove it home like a stake through a vampire's heart, telling the Phoenix crew that this was their one chance to climb back into their pretty cars and drive away with their pride and their blood both mostly intact, because the man standing beside her was known across 8 states as someone who did not lose fights and did not leave witnesses. And if they forced this to violence, the desert would swallow them the way it had swallowed countless others who made bad decisions. It was a calculated bluff, because while the bad guy had a reputation, it was not quite as fearsome as she painted it, but she sold it with absolute conviction, and more importantly, the bad guy backed her play without hesitation, stepping forward with the kind of movement that suggested violence was not something he prepared for, but something he simply was. The standoff held for long seconds, 40 Camaros rumbling, 80 or more sets of eyes trying to decide if manhood was worth dying for, and the desert wind carried the smell of gasoline and gunpowder that had not been fired yet, but hung in the air like a promise. The bartender watched from inside the dusty rows, probably taking bets with himself on how many bodies he would need to help bury. And the sun climbed higher, indifferent to human drama, baking the scene in harsh light that left no shadows to hide in. The blonde leader made his decision, and it was the smart one, even if it burned his pride to ash. He told his crew to stand down, to get back in their cars, spinning the retreat as tactical rather than cowardly, saying they would handle this another time, another place. The Phoenix crew retreated to their Camaros with varying degrees of grace, some clearly relieved, others burning with humiliation and fantasies of revenge. And slowly the mechanical thunder began to recede, 40 muscle cars pulling out of the parking lot in a long procession that looked less impressive in retreat than it had in arrival. The Vixen and the bad guy stood their ground until the last Camaro disappeared down the highway, until the rumble faded to memory and silence. And only then did they allow themselves to breathe, to acknowledge how close they had come to bloodshed that would have ended badly for everyone involved, regardless of who walked away. The bartender emerged from the dusty rows and offered them drinks on the house, a gesture of respect for people who had kept his parking lot from becoming a graveyard. And they accepted because denying a man's gratitude was poor form in the outlaw world. They sat in the bar as noon approached, drinking whiskey that burned clean. And the Vixen asked the bad guy why he stood with her, why he risked 40-2 odds for someone he had just met. And his answer came after long consideration, after he had examined his own motives and found them more complex than simple attraction or outlaw code. He told her that in 20 years of running roads and living free, he had met maybe 5 people who understood what freedom actually cost, who were willing to pay that price, and she was one of them. And people like that were worth standing beside because they were rarer than any muscle car, more valuable than any score. The Vixen absorbed this, understanding that it was as close to a declaration of love as men like the bad guy could manage. That he was offering partnership not in the romantic comedy sense, but in the way that mattered. Someone to watch your back, someone to trust with your life, someone to share the road. She reached across the table and took his hand, a simple gesture that carried weight, and told him she had been alone for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand with her, and if he wanted to run together for a while, see where the road led, she would not object to the company. They left the dusty rows in the early afternoon, the Vixen's Mustang and the bad guy's Camaro rolling out onto the highway side by side, 2 machines moving in harmony, heading west toward California, or north toward Montana, or south toward Mexico. The direction less important than the fact that they were moving together. The desert stretched endlessly around them, beautiful and harsh, the kind of landscape that killed the weak and made the strong stronger, and the highway unwound before them like a promise of adventures yet to come. The bad guy glanced over at the Vixen through his windshield, saw her dark hair whipping in the wind through her open window, saw the smile on her face that suggested she felt the same wild joy he did. The freedom of the open road multiplied by having someone to share it with. They were not thinking about tomorrow or next week or next year. Outlaws lived in the present because the future was never guaranteed. But in that moment, running parallel on that desert highway with engines roaring their defiance against a conformist world, they were alive in a way that most people never experienced, free in a way that could not be taken away, and together in a way that would change both of their stories forever. The highway stretched on toward the horizon, and somewhere behind them, the Phoenix crew was licking their wounds and plotting revenge that might come or might not. But that was a problem for another day. Today was for driving, for feeling the power of machinery responding to the touch, for the wind and the sun and the endless road, and for the beginning of something that would become legend among those who lived outside the law. The bad guy and the Vixen had found each other in the way that outlaws always did. By chance, by circumstance, by the strange magnetism that draws like souls together even when logic says they should stay apart. They did not know what the future held, did not know how their story would end. But they knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together, two equals on the outlaw road. Two hearts beating in time with 8 cylinders of American muscle. Two souls intertwined like the yellow lines of the highway that had brought them together and would carry them forward into whatever adventures awaited. The road took care of its own, the bad guy had said, and now the road had given them each other. And that was worth more than all the money in Phoenix, worth more than safety or security or any of the comfortable lies that normal people told themselves. They had the road, they had their cars, they had each other, and in the outlaw world of 1968, that was everything that mattered.